Thanks, comrades. Okay, Uses and Abuses of Antonio Gramsci. I won't go through Peter's book, people will be pleased to hear, although it's very good. Abuses first, then. There are myriad abuses. We can start with the distortion of Gramsci's work as issued by, in bits and pieces after his death, by the Italian Communist Party, from, as any student in the room, or anybody who has been a student recently, or indeed teachers, the inescapable theory of hegemony if you're studying history or politics or philosophy or media studies or education or virtually anything. Gramsci is used as the kind of acceptable face of Marxism, if you like. His work's been used to support the notion of gradualist change in the West, and to focus on challenging ideas divorced from any revolutionary activity. But my personal favourite abuse, if you like, is relatively recent. This is Michael Gove speaking, speaking in February this year. In shaping education policy, I've been influenced by many people. I've been inspired by the leadership of brilliant head teachers, blah, 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 blah. Two particular individuals have influenced me more than any others. The Italian Marxist thinker and father of Eurocommunism, Antonio Gramsci. Da, 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 da. For an analysis of these forces which do stand in the way of liberating young people from the chains of ignorance, I would recommend close attention to the work of Gramsci. I agree entirely. But, you know, really, when Michael Gove, the architect of, you know, the destruction of education and any grasp of history whatsoever to claim Gramsci, something is clearly wrong and his work is clearly distorted. So what I would like to concentrate on, people are welcome to chuck in more abuses in the discussion if they like. But what I'd like to concentrate on is what is left out, because that is pretty fundamental to Gramsci's story. And what's left out is that Gramsci was a Marxist whose theory, however fashionable it is in explaining the continued success and wonders of capitalism these days, was actually developed in an attempt to analyse and understand the tremendous crisis that Italian society was going through in the period after the First World War. A period between 1919 and 1921, where the country was racked in what is now known as the Biennio Rosso, the two red years, racked by tremendous crisis, workers' occupations of the factory, the potential for revolution embodied in that, in peasant seizures of land, in soldiers' mutinies, tremendous fundamental crisis of society that swept the country. His work, Gramsci was trying to grapple with that. He was an activist in that movement, and then to grapple with the reasons for its defeat, the defeat of the factory councils at the end of 1920, and the rise of fascism and the fundamental defeat of the Italian working class subsequently. And crucially, his work was then continuing to attempt to intervene in the debates around the way forward for the workers' movement in the 20s and 30s, despite being in prison for the vast bulk of that time. Everything that Trotsky wrote, that Gramsci wrote and tried to understand and grapple with, as complicated as some of it is, for reasons that I'll explain, everything was geared towards attempting to understand the balance of forces, to understand the trajectory of the potential of workers' revolution, to understand what revolutionaries needed to do to push the revolution forward with the ultimate aim of overthrowing capitalism. Absolutely nothing to do with simply challenging ideas or changing ideas in the absence of changing society. The two for Gramsci were inextricably linked. His theory was an interventionist theory, a set of theories that were based, in other words, on practical experience and that aimed at shaping future revolutionary activity. And the separation, I think, you know, years after his death, but the separation of concepts like hegemony, which I'll explain a little bit later on, or go through a little bit later on, from the material context, the roots that those theories came from, really robs those concepts of their power to explain really anything, which is exactly how they've then become to be used by people as widely diverse from ourselves and Michael Gove. So just a brief sketch of what those events were to set the context for people who might not be familiar with it. The times that Gramsci was living in, the most decisive events of his life that shaped his thought were the period that broke out during the First World War. Gramsci became an active revolutionary in 1914 in Turin, and was shaped by the war itself and the revolutionary upheaval that followed it. 1917, comrades will know, the Russian Revolution broke out. The war is still going on. The first worker state had been installed in Russia, governed through Soviets, through direct democratic representatives of workers and soldiers and so forth, and a wave of social upheaval swept Europe, tremendously important. So he's trying to grapple with this. Secondly, the ebbing of that revolutionary tide. Tragically, the move away from revolution, the defeat of revolutions, and then the struggle inside the Third International, the grouping of communist parties, to reorient those parties in order to deal with how do we now move the project of revolution forward when its immediate insurrectionary potential is off the agenda. So crucially, through the adoption of the tactic of the United Front, attempting to ally with workers and parties to the right of them, and so on and so forth. And thirdly, to deal with the tragic isolation and distortion of the Russian Revolution and the eventual abandonment of internationalism and the ultra-left tactics under Stalin, the victory of the Nazis and the defeat of the German working class. This is the general picture, one of tremendous moves forward and catastrophic defeats for the workers' movement. And for Gramsci, who was born in Sardinia in 1891 and, as I said, became politically active in 1914 and then died in a fascist prison in 1937, his life pretty much encapsulates that entire period. And for him, the burning questions really were, I'd argue, threefold. One, how to translate the experience of the Russian Revolution to his own country, to Italy, and to Western Europe more generally, but an attempt to grapple with what were the key lessons from the revolution in Russia. Secondly, how to attempt to win influence in the working class when revolution is off the immediate agenda. How do revolutionaries do that? And thirdly, to look at the nature of class power. How does the ruling class rule? How does it maintain its rule? We need to understand what we're up against. What is the enemy? How does the ruling class influence and maintain a degree of consent amongst workers and the general population? The importance of the working class to have its own party and to create its own intellectuals and its own politics was part and parcel of what lay behind the ideas that Gramsci was trying to work out during his active life and what he spent a decade in prison trying to clarify. So the 2 red years between 1919 and 1920 were, as I said, the formative experience of Gramsci's political life. Crucially, in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution, and perhaps it's hard to grasp now the magnitude of what the working class and peasant victory over the Tsar, autocratic leader in Russia was. With the triumph of the Russian Revolution, workers' power moved from being a kind of abstract discussion, or in the future workers could become revolutionary, or in the future socialism is possible, to being concretely posed. This had actually happened, and at a period where society is being riven by the carnage of the First World War. Not only did you have the existing parties of the working class, the Second International parties, who called themselves Marxists, talked about socialism and so on and so forth. Not only did you have that key pole of attraction completely collapsing into support for the war in 1914, now you also had, as a sort of counterpart, if you like, the mirror image, the Russian working class concretely proving to be revolutionary in practice. And this kind of twin crisis, if you like, meant that you saw a wave of revolutionary movements growing across Europe, in Germany, Austria, Hungary, and so forth, and many other countries, including Britain, very deeply shaken by what happened. In Italy particularly, the war was deeply unpopular right from the beginning. Actually, the Italian Socialist Party was the only party, apart from the Bolsheviks, that in the Second International, that openly opposed the war. And it was unpopular in a way that was reinforced by extreme state repression. Although Italy was a liberal state, a functioning parliamentary democracy, and so on. It had a very strong militaristic element anyway, and this was exacerbated during the war. Wartime demands also completely transformed the nature of Italian society. I mean, remember, this is a society that had not existed 50 years before the war, in the sense of being a unified country. It had only been unified for 50 years. People had all sorts of different affiliations, regional connections and so forth, but crucially, an economy that was based primarily on agricultural production moved almost overnight into one in which industrial capacity was expanded tenfold. So people who had been agricultural workers pulled into the factories, a qualitative transformation taking place in the working class, and therefore the balance of class forces and the relationships between classes. From 1917, with the events in Russia, Italy experienced a corresponding level of strikes, in part because of the newness of the working class, in part because of repression in the factories under wartime demands and so on, and in part because of the flame that had been lit by events in Russia. The experience of the war, Gramsci argued, was fundamental to impacting on the condition and psychology of all the classes in Italian society. And for him, as a member of the Socialist Party, the Italian Socialist Party, he said the following: 4 years of war have rapidly changed the economic and intellectual climate. Vast workforces have come into being, and a deeply rooted violence in the relations between wage earners and entrepreneurs, bosses, has now appeared in such an overt form that it's obvious to even the dullest onlooker. A new class consciousness has emerged, not only in the factories but in the trenches as well. This consciousness is at an elementary level. It's raw material waited to be moulded, and it should be our doctrines that do the moulding. In other words, what we have is a transformation of the working class, is revolutionary consciousness, or the beginnings of that emerging at all levels of society, and the Socialist Party should go in, intervene and fight very hard to pull that in a revolutionary direction. And Gramsci was right in that that desire for change was absolutely reflected in the growth of socialist organisations. There was, often it has to be said, without them doing very much to encourage this. But you know, you had the Italian Socialist Party grew tenfold from 23,000, nice problem to have, from 23,000 in 1918 to 200,000 2 years later. I mean, really an extraordinary set of changes, I mean, quite sort of inconceivable at one level, really massive. In the elections in November 1919, essentially important, the Socialist Party won nearly 2 million votes, with still quite a restricted franchise, by the way. And the Trade Union Federation, the central one, grew from 250,000 to 2 million workers. That's in a very short period of time, you know, 18 months to 2 years, quite extraordinary. Unfortunately, the left, as encompassed in the Socialist Party, really failed to match the aspirations that were encapsulated in those statistics that I've just briefly given. So, just to explain why, in a nutshell, the Socialist Party had within it three main currents, you know, it wasn't a combat revolutionary organisation, a vanguard party on the model of the Bolsheviks, in part because it didn't have to be, because it was operating in a parliamentary democracy. So you had, on the one hand, reformists, open reformists, who controlled the Trade Union Federation at the top, the organised group of MPs in the Parliament, most of the local councillors, that kind of parliamentary wing of things. You had a sort of centre block called the Maximalists, or centrists, whichever you prefer, who were in the official leadership of the party. So you have MPs on one hand who aren't in the leadership. You have the leadership of the sort of managerial and propaganda element, and then ultra-lefts, abstentionists, around a figure called Bordiga, on the other side. So several different poles within the organisation. So although the party was very vocal in terms of revolutionary slogans, very vocal about calling for revolution, calling for socialism and so forth, and very vocal inside the Third International, the grouping of communist parties, it actually took a very complacent attitude, basically assuming that the revolution was on its way, an inevitability. You know, there was really nothing they needed to do. It was going to kind of fall in their laps, and took very little initiative in terms of attempting to mould that new class consciousness that Gramsci had pointed to. So really the only strand of the organisation that engaged with the struggles and understood the need to draw them together was Gramsci's very small group, which produced a journal called The New Order, L'Ordine Nuovo, in Turin. Turin was a centrally important city, one of the key 3 cities in northern Italy that where wartime production was based. It was the home of Fiat and so forth. You know, in and of itself, with an organised workforce that had grown from 4,000 to 40,000 in that same 2-year period. You know, transformed the entire city. Very, very important place. And workers in Turin had been particularly militant, so had struck in 1917 openly against the war, not just for wages, but to protest at the fact that the war was happening at all, struck again to support the Russian Revolution, greeted Russian revolutionaries when they went to visit Turin with shouts of "Long live Lenin," which must have gone down not too well with the employers, and so we're in the forefront really of workers' action after the war. And Gramsci and his group, their focus was really on the question of what they were seeing in Russia in the form of council democracy. You know, so in Russia what you had was ordinary people, workers, peasants, soldiers and so forth, directly electing their representatives, you know, direct form of democracy based on Soviets or councils. Now, Gramsci's, by looking at what he could glean about what was happening in Russia, it seemed to him, he argued that the question of direct democracy had clearly been concretely raised by the revolution, but and one that wasn't mediated by the Socialist Party or by unions or whatever, but workers' direct representation. But what he took from the Russian example was that rather than something that might occur post-revolution, you know, after the revolution we will organise ourselves on this basis or that basis with workers being represented and so forth. Instead, he argued that those factory councils were key components of making the revolution. You know, that in the process, by looking at the Russian revolutionary experience of the Soviets being formed in the period between February and October, began to grasp that they were a key mechanism of pulling the revolution forward. So accordingly, his small group threw themselves into promoting the transformation of existing kind of factory shop committees into precisely that sort of overt political form of Soviet. So factory councils were created where delegates were elected by all workers in the factory, whether they were unionised or not, and so on and so forth. Met with a fantastic response. By the end of October 1919, 50,000 workers and 30 plants were organised into councils. 2 months later, that was 150,000 workers. You know, really cut with the grain of where workers were moving. But despite their success, the councils were opposed from all sides, including within the Socialist Party. So the reformists thought they were a form of anarchism. The maximalists argued that the Socialist Party was the only force that could lead the working class, and Bordiga, who quite rightly saw the need to break with the Socialist Party, counterposed that project to encouraging the council movement. And the inflexibility of the party and the unions really made them incapable of relating to the way in which workers' consciousness was developing in a very rapidly moving situation. Gramsci's argument was that by relating, if the party could relate correctly, engage with the council movement, it could and seek to push it forward, it could re-engage with those people that it was claiming to speak to or speak for by calling for revolution and calling for socialism, and break out of the sort of passive role it was taking as a spectator to a crisis where it was simply providing a sort of vocal, relatively meaningless encouragement. And in the process, Gramsci argued, a new leadership based on the revolutionary workers in the council movement could be created within the party, something that he saw as being crucial to renew and ensure the continued relevance of the party. Now, since we know that fascism triumphed in Italy, we know that this didn't come off as a plan, but you know, his arguments weren't heeded, and at the end of 1920, the factory occupations that had followed on from the factory council movement were defeated after a long strike over 11 days, central strike, and then a confrontation with the employers in August 1920. So although the factory councils had come and the occupations that were that involved far more workers had come to epitomise the closest that Italy came to its revolutionary moment, if you like. Gramsci argued that social hierarchies were smashed during the factory occupations, historical values were turned upside down, and the working classes have, which I think this is a lovely phrase, taken leadership over themselves. You know, so although this was the real possibility, unfortunately they came close to a political seizure of power. Again, Gramsci argues that although the situation, and I quote, indicates the extent of the proletariat's power, working class's power, it does not in or of itself produce any new definite position. Power remains in the hands of capital, armed force remains the property of the bourgeois state. And this was the problem. And when push came to shove, Prime Minister effectively did a deal with the Socialist Party and the union leaders, who made concessions instead of pushing forward to challenge the state. And the occupations were defeated. The minute that, more or less the minute actually, that the movement was defeated, you had the landowners and industrialists and so forth, of course, turning on the working class movement and using the fascists as a tool of reaction. Now, with the defeat of the factory councils, Gramsci is involved in the formation of the Communist Party, the break from the Socialist Party. I'm not going to spend any time on this at all because there is a meeting on Gramsci and the Revolutionary Party which will cover that, significant as it was. But in 1926, after Gramsci had become the head of the Communist Party, Mussolini outlawed the CP and arrested all the leaders, including Gramsci, who was condemned to 20 years in prison in order, as the fascist prosecutor said, to stop his brain from working. Fortunately, for us that bit didn't work, although obviously the experience of being in prison, censorship of the fascist censors and so on, meant that although his writings from prison really are quite extraordinary and cover a vast range of subjects, which I can't even begin to cover, they are often relatively obscured, the language is often difficult, and there are allusions to and sort of red herrings sent out so that the censors think that they're actually talking about something else, which is partly why the distortion of his thought is sort of, you can get away with it, you know, because it's made more complicated. It's often not as blunt as it could be, but then we wouldn't have seen it at all if it was. So, you know, you have to deal with these things. A few central points, though, about the prison notebooks. There are, I think, three really centrally important themes in the prison notebooks, and I want to deal very briefly with them and with some of the misreadings. And all of them flow from the experience that I've just discussed. You know, there is no fundamental break between an active Gramsci and an intellectual Gramsci. These two things are utterly connected. His politics are attempting, his theory is attempting to explain and clarify, work out what happened to the Italian revolutionary moment. Firstly, he drew a distinction between Russia, a Tsarist state, autocratic, no reformist current, no Socialist Party, no Labour Party, nothing of that ilk, through a distinction between Russia, the East, as he referred to it, and the West, parliamentary democracies in which there is a functioning civil society, political parties, trade unions, media, churches, and so on and so forth. And he argued that while in Russia the force of the state was the key way in which the ruling class maintained dominance, you know, in the absence of having political parties and so on to convince people, really repression was the way in which the Tsar dealt with most struggles, most revolt against his rule, as people probably know. Counterposed to that, in the West, the presence of institutions like the media, churches, parties, and so on and so forth meant that that sort of drew in more members of society, or all members of society really. Those institutions provided a kind of mediating layer through which the ruling class was able to exert a degree of ideological dominance, or what Gramsci referred to as hegemony. In other words, it doesn't need to simply beat people over the head, because it also has all these institutions by which it can convince, but ensure a degree of consent to its rule. And his argument is, these things matter, these are differences. How do we deal with the differences as revolutionaries? So he uses a series of military analogies to describe the different forms of class struggle that he thinks are required under different circumstances. One is the war of manoeuvre, in which opposing armies push forward and are pushed backwards rapidly. The situation between 1919 and 1921, for example, would be quite a good example of rapid move forward and retreats backwards. And a war of position, a more long drawn out struggle, more akin to the trench warfare that the world had just experienced. That set of analogies and that concept of East versus West has since been taken to mean, or distorted to seem to mean, that in the West the ruling class rules by consent, not force. Therefore, the tactics of the Russian Revolution, as appropriate as they might have been in the East, because there was autocracy and you have no choice but to fight repression with violence or with revolution, insurrection, there's really no need to be doing that in the democratic West, because consent is everything. Here, in order to change things, or in the democratic West in order to change things, instead there should be a gradual war of position, incrementally attempting to win people over to a project of socialism, kind of until you tip. I'm not quite sure, you know, as if there's a sort of tipping point after which you've got one extra person and you drop into socialism. So, it's a good idea if it was going to work. But so, in other words, hegemony, the concept became about, distorted into a slow winning over of influence, counterposed to an insurrectionary movement. So hegemony as a concept then becomes shorn, I think, of all its interesting elements, and simply becomes a byword for how the ruling class maintains its power through ideas, and the question of the overthrow of the state just disappears from the equation. And this has obviously allowed reformists and academics to, you know, claim Gramsci since the 60s at any rate as somehow separate from the Bolsheviks, standing in a different Western Marxist tradition that has no part and no connection with insurrection. In actual fact, all Gramsci was doing was stating the differences between the Russian situation and revolutionary movements elsewhere. And in this, he's following Lenin. Lenin had argued himself in 1918 that the relative weakness of the Tsarist state in Russia had made the conquest of power by Soviets easier than it would have been if it was in a more developed country, for example, Germany. So he says, the revolution will not come in those countries, this is Lenin, as quickly as we'd hope. History has spoken, we have to know how to recognise the reality and recognise that in the advanced countries, the socialist revolution will not begin as easily as it did in Russia. Gramsci's not saying anything that isn't recognised, in other words, inside the revolutionary movement. Crucially, what he's trying to do is synthesise the experience of a series of specific historical circumstances and learn from those mistakes. How can we address these? During the war, for example, the Socialist Party welcomed the revolution, but mechanically assumed that revolution would take exactly the same form as it had in Russia, and therefore had literally missed, or ignored or dismissed movements that could have genuinely become revolutionary movements. So when there were mutinies and soldiers and peasants seizing the land and so on, the leadership of the party refused to view them as potentially revolutionary because they didn't look as they did in Russia. So Gramsci's argument was, rather, you need to look at revolutionary moments as they are shaped by, in this case, Italian circumstances and traditions. He was trying, in other words, to provide a sort of Italian translation, if you like, of the Russian Revolution that didn't expect a mechanical copy, but looked at real social forces and ideological obstacles on the ground. Later on, he's conducting an argument over the question of the United Front at a time when Stalinism, in a distortion of the Russian Revolution, Stalinism was arguing that reformist organisations were just the left-wing face of fascism, and Communist Party shouldn't work with them. You know, completely lunatic position. You know, in circumstances like that, it makes perfect sense to argue that through the importance of winning the support of workers through Parliament, through unions, through whatever other bodies there are, and through patient, systematic work and argument and so forth. In other words, under those concrete circumstances, it was a political argument to say, rather than cut yourself off from the majority of reformist workers, which is the position taken by Stalin, actually we need to engage and try to construct an alternative proletarian hegemony or ideological dominance in the class that can undermine the whole of ruling class ideas and create a mass revolutionary movement that could confront the state. But Gramsci's very, very clear that the hegemony of the ruling class is not an alternative to force. It's not the case that consent in the West, the way that the ruling class supposedly rules, is an alternative. Rather, the two aspects are interrelated and interdependent. So, in other words, he argues the normal exercise of hegemony under a parliamentary system is characterised by a combination of force and consent which counterbalance each other, without force predominating excessively over consent. Rather, it appears to be based on the consent of the majority. In other words, it might not look obvious that the ruling class in the democratic West bases its rule on force. It doesn't most of the time, but nevertheless force underwrites the appearance of consent, and Gramsci is very, very clear on this. In other words, what he's arguing is that hegemony, social classes compete for leadership over other social classes in society and the institutions that I've talked about, but that hegemony is only guaranteed by the ownership or seizure of political institutions, by the state, by bodies of armed men. That's how it's ensured. Also, a reading, I think, of hegemony that sees it as simply a kind of complex of mechanisms through which the ruling class maintains power removes the dynamic relationship between classes in society. So, in other words, rather than an image of society in which there are continual contradictions where ruling class domination is simply reproduced in perpetuity, which is sort of the way hegemony is often put, rather than that, academic called David Forgax has described it like this, and I think this is exactly right. Hegemony is better understood, he says, as the product on the one hand of a constant negotiation of interests between the ruling political bloc and the social groups which support it and seek to influence its policies, and on the other of a deflection and containment of the demands of antagonistic groups. In other words, hegemony is continually at the risk of being destabilised, and in times of crisis might collapse and have to be entirely reconstituted and recomposed. You know, this is a dynamic process. It's not simply brainwashing. In other words, for Gramsci, hegemony is contested. The worldview that we receive is not always uncritically and continually consented to. If it was, there wouldn't be any need for force at all. We would just all be brainwashed into thinking exactly the same thing. You know, so that would be ruling by consent, if you could call it that. But that's not the situation. Neither is it the situation that ruling class hegemony is continually on the verge of collapse. A lot of the time, subordinate classes, you know, as in working classes, do consent. These two things are interconnected. And Gramsci describes this reality, and it's a dynamic one. He sees workers' consciousness, that relationship between not being brainwashed but an element of consent to the nature of capitalist society and so forth, as contradictory. Workers' consciousness is contradictory, and partly it's implicitly inclined towards unity, towards solidarity through work, through collectivity, through union activity, and so on and so forth. And partly it's explicit or verbal, he calls it. In other words, you have the kind of instinct for unity and solidarity with your own class on the one hand, and a sort of accepted notion of bourgeois ideas that are given to you, fed to you by the media and so forth on the other. These things are in tension. They don't agree with one another. There's a continual tension. Now, under lots of circumstances, that tension doesn't become obvious, but under certain circumstances, the experiences and conditions that the working class is living under push it into struggle against the ruling class, at which point those received ideas, common sense as Gramsci referred to it, come into conflict with reality, and a new set of ideas that accurately reflect new circumstances and so forth come into being. That's what happened during the factory occupations. In other words, this theory is about the factory occupations. That's exactly what took place when Gramsci argued about how their group had been able to give concrete expression to an aspiration latent in the consciousness of the working people. That's exactly what he's describing. In other words, part of, just to finish, the process of the working class becoming aware of its own capacity to rule is the process of individuals within it becoming politically conscious. This is a dynamic process. It's not the case that people's ideas stay static. Gramsci talked about he referred to this process, workers in the working class becoming politically conscious as the process of the working class developing its own organic intellectuals. In other words, people from within the class, not imposed from outside, you know, with the sort of title of intellectual, but politically conscious workers emerging from within the class who can then help to win over the mass of workers to a similar grasp of their own power in order to transform the common sense of ruling class domination. And that is, crucially, to develop its own organisations and its own party and attempt to create its own hegemony. So ultimately, in other words, the creation of a proletarian hegemony, the creation of an alternative set of ideological dominance, the creation of revolutionary organisation in which workers have their own intellectuals, their own leaders and so forth, is not the end of the revolutionary process in the West. That's not the best that workers can hope to achieve, but a necessary precursor to a violent seizure of power. There is nowhere in Gramsci that this is not made clear if you know what you're looking for. So in other words, just to finish, there's nothing in Gramsci that makes him anything like a champion of passivity or reformism, and hopefully it's clear that there's a lot to learn from him. Any real serious consideration of his political life and his work, I think, unequivocally shows the direct living link between his practice as a revolutionary activist in the seismic events in Italy and the theoretical understanding he developed in the most difficult and isolating of circumstances. You know, his life was spent trying to contribute to the political development of the Italian working class through consistent internationalism and a continual insistence on Marxism and its relevance as a dynamic theory of class society. It has to be said, at enormous political cost. Imprisonment cost him his health and ultimately his life. And at a time when fascism had triumphed and Stalinism had utterly distorted socialist politics and the notion of genuine revolutionary change, I think that's a tremendous achievement by anybody's standards. And I think in return, revolutionaries now should really learn from that spirit and insist on the revolutionary dialectically Marxist method at the heart, rather than accept notions of hegemony and so forth as stripped of their dynamic content. As Peter Thompson wrote in The Guardian in response to Gove's speech, which I started with, does Michael Gove really want to invoke a theoretician who wrote in 1924 that we need to educate people in order that they can challenge the brainwashing that secures the positions of the powerful, and who also said that we need neither fascism nor liberalism but Sovietism? Then maybe he should be a bit more careful what he wishes for.
Thank you for that talk on Gramsci. I have a couple of questions and a couple of ideas that may affect how the failure of the Red Years, the failure of the Italian Communist Party. At one stage during the Red Years, Bruno Rosso, as Megan said, Fiat, boss of Fiat, actually said, "You can take the bloody factory here, have it," you know. And the workers walked away. No, they'll keep it. The main thing that compromises me in my thinking around the background to the Italian Communist Party and to Mussolini and the fascism is that from about 1900 there had been a development of what originally was laughingly known as the Black Hand Gang, but different mafia in Sicily, in southern Italy and in Naples, which is where my grandmother came from, but we're neither in nor there. But all these raps, as they call them, little gangs, festered. The reason the population of, if you like, workers mushroomed was that many people left the south, which was totally poverty-stricken, and moved into the factories in the north. Hence the massive growth. But unfortunately, what they left behind was the nucleus of a reactionary, bigoted gangsterism that was propped up by the Catholic Church, again a reactionary, bigoted gangsterism, that ended up with the Concordat, the Risorgimento in '23 with Mussolini, and all this background, yes, brings you to a situation where the Communist Party is trapped historically between gangsterism, the concept of Stalinism, which was starting to creep in, the ideas behind what Stalin was trying to do, and Mussolini then locking up Gramsci And if, no matter what you make of the prison notebooks, if you're stuck in isolation, talking to nobody other than your jailers, you can't get anywhere. Thanks for your time.
After the comrade with the Gramsci t-shirt, you with the glasses.
In fact, if anybody wants to buy a Gramsci souvenir t-shirt, I think these will be available tomorrow and Sunday from the Anucha store here at Marxism. This is the only time you will be able to buy one of these. So the recommendation here is to get the shovel out and dig in while the going's good. Thank you.
And I haven't seen anyone indicate after this, comrade, so if you are, but if you would like to ask a question, then please feel free to do so.
Yeah, I just wanted to raise a couple of points. What Megan drew out in the introduction, that really is one of the issues about the contradictory consciousness, because I think that is a day-by-day fantastic framework in which, whether you're in work, to be honest, at the pub, in any campaign, anytime you're fighting, you will come across people who want to fight, resist, think about the bedroom tax, any meeting on any estate, hate what's happening to them, but in almost every bedroom tax, anti-bedroom tax estate, the issue about immigration has come up. There is a contradiction. And one of the great things about Gramsci arms you is you don't walk away. You don't say, I heard something bloody awful, I'm off. You have to use the hostility to what's happened to people, the ability to organise, to fight, and in the process revolutionaries alongside those people start to shift the consciousness of those involved. And when you start to see people move on a big scale, that happens not as individuals, but in their millions. It's quite difficult, I think, for us, having lived in Britain all these years, we've not that experience to see, and you can look at it in Egypt, how millions of people can shift in very, very quick numbers. But I think the other thing with Gramsci on the contradictory consciousness, it's not just between two sets of ideas. The contradiction between what people do and their ideas, right? And that's quite, again, it's difficult if we haven't been part of that. But workers can set up workers' councils, which from our point of view is the embryonic form of a future workers' state, and still believe that the old order effectively has to remain. There is a contradiction in what they do and what they believe. And you'll even see this on picket lines. Even where I work in sunny South Gloucestershire, when we have a picket line, there's 20 people on a picket line. Someone says, is this illegal? And the people try to, oh, it doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. But they'll want to accept the law. I mean, all the time you have that contradiction. The last point is this, on the question of East versus West. You see, I think it is a question about, Megan's right, about balance. You see, in Russia, it isn't true that they didn't try to get consent. Right, when the workers marched first in 1905, who do they march to? The Tsar. Not to burn down the bloody, not to burn down his palace, to say, please, little father, don't you know what they're doing to us? When 1914 the war broke out in Russia, there were processions in support of the war. They tried, often through the church, through institutions, but the ability of the ruling class in that society was much weaker in terms of and the last point is, Megan's absolutely right, contested. Everything is contested on a hegemony. And the last point is the question of organisation, revolutionary organisation, being part of that contesting element, organising people, working with it, is absolutely the central lesson, I think, from Gramsci. So I'll leave it there. And then come right at the back.
Yes, thank you for that talk. It was very accessible, which I think sometimes when people talk about Gramsci or want to know about Gramsci and they read lots of things that people have written or they learn about it at university, it is put across as quite incomprehensible. And one of our comrades who gave a talk about it in Sydney, said that it says a lot about academia that they hold up these ideas which were written in the context of a prison under fascist censors and deliberately altered to be confusing and, with certain types of vocabulary that people wouldn't be able to understand, and they hold this up as, exactly how things should be written and how people should speak to each other. Says a lot about academia. But Gramsci himself actually, and his whole argument is not about locking yourself in a tower and isolating yourself away from the struggle. Actually, his whole argument was against the abstentionism and I guess in that sense the non-interventionist approach of the Italian Communist Party and the reformism on the other hand of the Socialist Party. So I think in that sense when Gramsci is held up in this way as sort of inaccessible, but when I began to read some of it and so on, you realise actually so much of this is a brilliant explanation of stuff that's quite straightforward to socialists and a part of things we do every day. And I think some of that, what he talks about the tension between the common sense, so the ideas that people learn in school, at university, and in day-to-day life, that they can't run things for themselves, that they must defer to the higher powers, to Parliament and so on, and what he calls good sense, which is the lessons that people learn from struggle, the things that they learn from past struggles, the things that they learn in their trade unions, and that sort of instinct of solidarity and so on that people learn in their collective work in the workplace, and the tensions between those two ideas and the way that they're muddled up inside people's heads, and that he marries that with the I think the understanding of the united front, and the way that inside the united front and inside struggle in particular, the way that the tensions between that common sense and that good sense start to actually come out in a very, very rich way and provide an opportunity for socialists to intervene and win wider influence for their ideas. So thanks for that.
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes I think we can exaggerate to what extent the prison notebooks were wrote as sort of like a code. I think, I mean, Gramsci's method seemed to be one of taking concepts from other people and reworking them constantly, so you'll get many definitions of something that was used in the past, and I think you can see that in the prison notebooks. For example, he talks about the modern prince a lot, and then on one page he just puts modern prince equals revolutionary party, just as like, to bring it out. So I think that's more of what his method was really. In terms of the war position, I think it was about the differences between the West and the East, but also just about the period that you had sizable revolutionary parties, but they hadn't won mass support among the working class. And it was about how do we win the mass of people to revolutionary politics when the revolutionary wave had receded, really. So, I mean, when Gramsci talks about the war position, moving to united front policy, he just basically attributes it to Lenin and says Lenin was the first person to see the importance of that move. But I think one of the main things that comes out in Gramsci's writings is the importance of independent revolutionary leadership and the revolutionary party. When he talks about struggle, he says there's no such thing as pure spontaneity, doesn't exist in human history. There's always going to be people arguing something in struggle, whether it's a demo or a strike, whether they call it leadership or not. Especially in the times of Occupy, maybe they're not so much call it leadership, but it does exist. So I think in his actual practice, he gives us a model of what revolutionary leadership is about. So with his journal, New Order, he tried to generalise the best experiences of militants and bring out the theoretical implications of it. And quite unmodestly, he says, why did the workers love New Order? Because they saw a part of themselves, the better part of themselves. Thanks.
I'll have to speak.
No, sorry, comrade here, and then you next. Yeah.
Sorry, it's Sophie, Manchester branch. So I'd just like to follow on from that point and talk about how we can build a parallel system and how we can use Gramsci's ideas and put them into practice. Sorry. Yeah, so how we can try and put Gramsci's ideas into practice and grow this parallel system. And I think the problem we've got to face at the moment is an environment of apathy and a general lacking of confidence in the working classes that I think we need to tackle, and I think this is through education. And I also wondered if anyone has any ideas about how we can kind of bring people into being more confident and trying to actually build this in practice.
But what I wanted to ask is a very specific question, because the Socialist Party was the official member of the Comintern. And when Gramsci wrote to the Comintern outlining his position, Lenin supported Gramsci, and the leadership of the Socialist Party forced Lenin, who I've never known him to do at any other time in his lifetime, to actually withdraw that support and come up with a modified version of stuff. That is how, I don't know how you describe it, how vicious the leadership of the Socialist Party was. a time of soaring membership, when it wants to associate itself with the glory of the Russian Revolution, when it's the official affiliated body, then goes and scabs on its greatest thinker, a militant. And the second question I wanted to ask is, Gramsci also did really understand the factory workers in Turin, and he really did appreciate the, you know, whatever their failings, and I'm no supporter of anarcho-syndicalism, but there was that tremendous stream of stuff inside the workers' movement, which was just pure rebellion. It wasn't focused, it wasn't organised, but Gramsci understood why it wasn't focused and organised, even though he wanted it to be. And I think that's one of his great achievements, was recognising that. And that's where the real truth about his conception of hegemony comes out. And I think one of the worst tragedies done to Gramsci was what the Euro-communists did in the 1970s onwards. And I won't name them all because there's so many of them. It was to totally destroy the actual meaning of hegemony, which is not simply an ideological struggle, it's a struggle for power.
I wanted to ask Megan a question. One of the abuses of Gramsci that many of us are familiar with is the discussion about the war manoeuvre and the war of position. Now, I agree with the speaker from a couple of times ago, Chris, who said that really the war of position is about us bringing people into the fight and actually arguing in front and bringing people in. But quite often the war of position is used to actually say what we need to do is to make sure we take control of parts of the media, parts of them, and then we need to get socialism to get involved, you know, in running the BBC and in running ITV, so we actually have that kind of state. Now, you know, well, that's an excuse some ways of stepping out of the struggle. There are some serious problems that we need to recognise when that crucial war of manoeuvre, when you have the revolution, is not the end of the story. Lenin spent the last year of his life, you know, not just fighting against the growth of bureaucracy, you know, amongst the Bolsheviks, but actually the control of pre-revolutionary bureaucrats had over the state. And one of the interesting things that Morsi supporters have been saying in Egypt over the last couple of weeks is, you know the problem that we had? Actually, it's the Mubarak bureaucracy that still controls the state, the army that controls the state. And actually we just couldn't do what we wanted to do. And this is part of a challenge that we have yet to do, is that actually having a revolution is not the end of the story. So in some ways, what if anything, you know, can Gramsci help us understand about this? And actually in some ways, what do we do about part of these real challenges? You know, and actually saying that, you know, actually, you know, the revolution is not the end of it, it's just the start of some of the challenges that we have.
Just a quick question really, it's more about Italy today. Does the emergence of the comedian Beppe Grillo and the Five Star Movement show resurgence of working class activity in Italy, or are we going to be left to Berlusconi?
It was a question about whether Beppe Grillo shows the emergence of working class activity in Italy. Sorry, yeah, the comment.
I have a question. I liked very much the presentation, and the situation that Gramsci was in is qualitatively different in important ways from our situation. There was a mass workers' movement that was very radical. Socialist ideas, revolutionary ideas were proliferating within that. Our situation is different, I know, in the United States, also in Britain. And so I'm interested on your thoughts about how to apply in our very different context these rich ideas that were developed in the 1920s, early 30s. Thanks.
I have a very specific question that I planned to ask a person, but I could state it here. I'm working as a publisher in Sweden, and Gramsci is at the moment almost completely absent from debate, and I would just ask your opinion. What would be a good selection today? Would it be the same selection, the old Togliatti Platone selection, from, or I mean, we are not in. It's not possible for us to do the critical edition.
So thanks everyone. I'll give you Megan to wrap it up.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thanks, comrades. That was really, really interesting and very helpful. Okay, a couple of quick ones to start with. Comrade from Sweden, there is a new edition of the prison notebooks, which is excellent and much better. I don't have a second at the minute to find the cover, but I'll talk to you about it afterwards. And there are other ideas, so I'm sure we can come up with something. Secondly, on Grillo, if only really. I mean, the difficulty in Italy, and I'll put this briefly, but again, if you want to chat to me afterwards, that's fine. In a nutshell, what's happened is I think Grillo represents a kind of a populist outrage and understandable anger at recession and Berlusconi and corruption and so forth. But the reality is that the organised working class is the organised working class in Italy is potentially very powerful, but its leadership have virtually disappeared, and that means that I think the anger that is understandably expressed is kind of shooting out all over the place. Grillo, to me, represents one of those kind of shotgun approaches. Interesting, of course, that he's able to get where he does, and there have been other straws in the wind like that, the mayoral vote in Rome and so on and so forth. But at the moment, I think there is a process of almost an entire vacuum on the left, without which Grillo just wouldn't have been able to step into it. The fact that a sort of joke candidate, if you like, is able to occupy that position is really because the only perceived left opposition now are, and this is absolutely true, speaking to friends in Italy, are those sorts of comedians and media types who are prepared to get up and say critical. It's a bit like having the only opposition in this country being the panel of "Have I got news for you?" That's the sort of logic, which is not. It's an interesting straw in the wind. It's not a good situation currently, and actually, although I have doubts about Berlusconi's capacity to come back, but that's a really stupid thing to say, probably, because we've been here before. It's forces to the right of Berlusconi that I would actually be much more concerned about, to be honest. But I have no idea how that's going to play out. Back to Gramsci then. A couple of points that are connected. So I'm going to try to do it as a piece. The question on how do we build confidence, how does contradictory consciousness and the theory of hegemony and so forth help us with this, and the related question from the comrade who talks about the war of position and war of manoeuvre. How can we apply these things in a concrete sense? And I want to take them together because I think they're connected. On the question of how do we build confidence, comrades know from practically talking to people, being involved in campaigns and having political arguments that stem from those over, as Hugh said, immigration, or whether it's over a strategy in that campaign, or attempting to pull people from a position that says we should just lobby MPs to a position which says no, we should go on strike, or have a big demonstration or whatever. There is a process of attempting to win confidence that is dual, isn't it? It's partly activity on the ground. It's an experienced, concrete, collective thing, in the course of which you're attempting to sway what people think in their heads. And this is precisely what Gramsci's talking about. The notion of contradictory consciousness means that instinctively, on the ground, in a practical sense, workers and their families and so on and so forth are practically and logically, if you like, collectively drawn towards collective responses to the attacks that they face. There is an inexorable logic towards solidarity and unity, because that's the only power that we have, is a collective one. We don't have power over the means of production, we don't have power over the media and so forth, but that is, so there's a logical instinct in the class that we see time and time again in historical examples, and that comrades will be familiar with in terms of their own campaigns. On the other hand, precisely because the ruling class is continually attempting to renegotiate reaffirm its hegemony, if you like, through all the institutions that we talked about, pumping out through the media, the kind of drivel that Gove is attempting to push through in schools. You know, make no mistake about it, that is about making sure that the next generation of workers, that our children, grow up thinking that capitalism is the best of all possible worlds. It is a form of teaching which teaches you not to think for yourself, which doesn't teach you about the broad spectrum of human experience, doesn't teach you about philosophy and so on and so forth, doesn't teach you about how to be a well-rounded organic intellectual who can think and move people forward. It teaches you to do as you're told. It teaches you to go into a job and be a drone, effectively. That's what that's about, you know, and therefore people are understandably caught in a cleft where most of the time, well, always one of those two things is going to dominate, and usually in periods of social peace it is the received ideas, not in a kind of, you know, nobody knows people at work. I mean, maybe one or two. The majority of people at work are in campaigns do not go around saying, you know, thank God for capitalism, I'm really pleased that, you know, I'm getting beaten over the head, and, you know, thank God there's a recession because I could just do with not having enough money. You know, of course not, of course not. Of course people continually contest it at the level of disgruntlement, you know, anxiety, you know, annoyance, discontent and so on. That doesn't necessarily lead to thinking everything that we're told is rubbish. You know, in order for that to happen, in order to break with the key notion of that the ruling class is continually trying to recompose, is, you know, that we're not capable of controlling society ourselves and the workers don't have power. That's the central notion that matters here. There has to be, by definition, those sets of ideas dominate until and unless confidence is raised through activity. And you see time and time again in revolutionary situations, we raise them because they're the most, they make the sharpest form of this point, but I think you can see it in smaller versions, if you like, or in kind of microcosm in lots of other campaigns. But in a revolutionary situation, when workers do move into struggle, often, you know, it's a situation in which your practical instinct towards collectivity outweighs what you think is possible. And confidence, in other words, confidence is built in part by practice, in part by the argument that flows from that practice, how your practice collides with the framework of received ideas that you have, and where that goes. Now, that's not an inevitable process. It is not the case that workers move into strikes, you know, go on strike, even if it's for the first time ever in South Gloucestershire or whatever. It's not the case that they just simply keep going, right? You know, that's it, the dam's burst. In order for that increasing confidence, which is usually kind of like that rather than like that, as we know, in order for that increasing confidence to actually be able to push forward to a true grasp of our own power, there needs to be a counter-tension from organic intellectuals organised inside a party that is continually, or parties depending on where you are in the world, or in movements as in Egypt, that is continually attempting to counterpose, to construct a counter-hegemony within capitalism. In other words, consciously attempting to engage and break, to engage with workers where they're most active, or people where they're most active, and break them from the ideas which prevent them from moving forward to the next step. And that's an incremental process, and it goes backwards and forwards, as we all know. Nonetheless, that concept, or the combined concepts of contradictory consciousness, hegemony, the fact that it is contested, the fact that revolutionary organisation is a central part of that contest. The Revolutionary Party is the instrument that the working class has in order to make that contest possible, to switch the balance over to a working class hegemony, if you like. These things are all actually not what somebody referred to me before I did this meeting as intellectual bollocks, but are actually central to what we do day to day. You know, and really Gramsci is attempting to do that. I think his ideas are continually relevant if we can grasp them in that way. So hopefully that helps. The last thing I wanted to say is just with reference to the prison notebooks and to Gramsci's language, because it can sound a bit frightening. You know, it can sound a bit like, oh Lord, you know, do I really want to go there? You know, well, and in places, there's no question, the prison notebooks are not an easy read. Peter Thomas's book, which makes them clear, it's not an easy read. You know, they are complicated ideas, but you know, by no means be put off everything that Gramsci writes, because I mean, I think everybody should have a go at the prison notebooks. You don't necessarily want to start there. Don't do a sort of body swerve or mental body swerve and think none of it's accessible. And so I'll finish with a quote from 1917 from Gramsci, and I think, you know, although he could be, he wrote often in complicated language and often dealing with relatively complicated concepts, he was also capable of being extremely clear, extremely on the money when it came to sharp political questions. So he writes about July 1917, the period between between the February Revolution in Russia and October, and he says the following. So we don't know what's going to happen, basically, right? We're in July, it's all looking a bit dicey. Lenin and his most prominent comrades could be swept away by the onset of the storms they themselves have stirred up, but not all their followers would disappear. By now there are too many of them, and the revolutionary fire is spreading, scorching new hearts and minds, turning them into glowing torches of new light, new flames, devouring all laziness and fatigue. The revolution will move forward until its consolidation is total. The time is still far off when there can be a period of relative calm, and life is always revolution. That is Gramsci.